Welcome back to the Boring Country Life. In this video, I'm going to show you how I make our meatless sandwich meat. And amazingly, it doesn't involve using bugs, no cockroaches or anything. So if you've never cooked beans before, there's multiple ways to do it. I no longer use the regular crock pot because it takes 8 to 10 hours and it makes my house smell like food all day long. And I'm in the house and I don't want to smell food all day long. And if I cook it overnight, then my husband has to smell cooking beans all night and he doesn't like that. So no more crock pots for us. You could cook it in a regular style pot like this on your stove for 2 to 3 hours and then the beans would be done. You can throw it in an Instant Pot and they vary on how long they take. Mine takes about 30 minutes to pressure cook most beans. And the third option, which I use as much as the Instant Pot, maybe a little bit more, would be this pressure cooker that goes on the stove top. And in this, once it comes to pressure, it cooks the beans in 5 to 6 minutes. And then you have to give it a little bit of time to cool down. So I still think it's faster than using the Instant Pot. No matter which option you want to cook with, it's best to soak your beans overnight the night before. They say you can cook them in the Instant Pot without soaking them, but I've never tried it. I like soaking the beans. So you want to cover them with 2, 3, or 4 inches above the beans with water because the beans are going to swell up overnight. They're going to double in size or more, and you want to make sure they stay underwater the whole time. So when you're ready to cook, then you're going to drain the beans, drain the water off. You're going to fill whatever cooking device you're using. I'm using the stovetop pressure cooker to cook these. So I'm going to put the beans in and then I'm going to fill the water to the level that the pot calls for. On this type of pressure canner, you just want to make sure your seal is in the right place and your lids are all just right, because if anything's off, then the water is going to leak out while it's cooking and you have to turn the heat off and start all over. I've done this several times before. But once it reaches the point where it's going to cook for 5 to 6 minutes, then you have that little top piece that's jiggling. And when that's all done cooking and you have the stove turned off and everything's cooled down, then you are ready to make the liquid portion of your dough mixture. Side note, I didn't even know that my kids were playing the piano while I was recording this, but I love hearing them when they are just playing whatever their heart wants to play. So I may leave it in the background throughout this video. Here we have another bugless recipe that vegetarians might like to use when they want to add a chicken seasoning to some of their food. This chicken seasoning, along with the gluten recipe, were created by my mother-in-law, who I am thankful for because, like I said in another video, she tests out the recipes. I get to reap the benefits. Into your blender, you will put 1 1/2 cups of yeast flakes, 1/2 cup of salt, 1 1/2 teaspoon of turmeric, 1 tablespoon of garlic, 3 tablespoons of onion, and by the way, that's garlic and onion powder, 1 1/2 teaspoons of marjoram, 1/2 teaspoon of sage, and 3 tablespoons of parsley. And all the herbs, of course, are dried. You just blend them until they're well mixed, store them in an airtight container. I also use that seasoning mix in several other recipes. It does go in my dairy-free broccoli potato soup and in my pot pie, which, by the way, doesn't have bugs. But I'll go ahead here and show you the gluten loaf recipe in which I use that chicken seasoning mix. In your blender, you're going to put in 2 cups of mostly drained cooked chickpeas, 1 1/2 cups of water, 1 tablespoon of the chicken seasoning. You could do that or a chicken bouillon cube. 3 tablespoons of yeast flakes, 3 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon of onion powder, 1/2 teaspoon to a full teaspoon of garlic. And you're going to put all this in the blender and blend it up. Do not put the gluten in your blender, okay? The gluten is the second part. In this part, we're only doing the beans, the water, and the spices. I am actually doubling this recipe because just about any time I make a recipe, I double it, because if I'm going to take the time to cook it or bake it, I might as well have enough for leftovers. So I've added the water, the chicken seasoning, the yeast flakes, salt, onion powder, and garlic powder. Those are both from our garden. We grew those. And then I'm going to blend them all up. If you're like me and you're trying to avoid plastic whenever possible, Did you know Vitamix has a stainless steel blender? It's a little bit smaller than the regular blender, but I really enjoy using it. And am I the only one that prefers to just put their hand on top of the blender to stop it from splashing up on the cabinets instead of actually putting the cover on the blender? You know, you use the masher so often, it's almost pointless putting the cover on there. So when I'm making this recipe, I think of it as two different sets of ingredients, the liquid set and the flour set. So now the liquid portion of the ingredients are done. That's the beans, the water, and all the spices. So I'm going to add them to my mixing bowl, and then I want to show you what the consistency of the liquid should look like. If it ever seems too runny, just add some more beans. If it ever seems too thick, just add some more water to it. Onto the flour portion of the ingredients. Now, I am doubling this recipe, so if you were only doing a single batch, it was 2.5 cups of flour. I'm going to be using 5 cups of flour. But if you have never worked with Vital Wheat gluten before, I usually only put like a half a cup when I'm doing a batch of 4 loaves of bread. I have a half a cup in that mixture. But gluten, this gluten loaf, is the other main time that I use gluten flour. If you ever spill it on your countertops and you need to wipe it up, either find a way to wipe it up dry or wipe it up with a paper towel, because gluten is like glue. If you use a wet cloth to wipe up gluten flour and then you try to rinse it off your cloth, it's not coming off. It's like glue. I have thrown away multiple cloths until I learned my lesson, and I just use paper towels from now on if I have to clean up a gluten spill. You are going to want to use a bread hook if you're using a KitchenAid to mix this with. I have never actually mixed this recipe by hand before. I've always used my KitchenAid, but you're going to let it keep mixing, and the gluten starts to form after a while. Sometimes I let it rest for 2 or 3 minutes. I'll turn the mixer off, let it rest, let the gluten develop, and then turn it back on again. But you want the gluten to come to the point to where it's not pulling apart as easily, where it's sticking together fairly well. When you're ready for it to come out of the mixing bowl, I usually find there's a little bit of flour still on the bottom, and you can just work that in by hand. But then I split the loaf, or the giant loaf. Remember, I doubled this recipe. So if you're doing a single batch, you're only going to have one of these balls of dough. But I have 2. And so now you're just going to form it into a really long log, basically. You can make it as flat as you want, as high as you want. I end up making mine so it takes 2 slices side by side on a piece of bread to make a sandwich. So you'll just see I make this into a long shape, the length of a 9x13 casserole, and I just kind of squeeze it to give it a lift and make it upright. Pinch it wherever I see the dough cracking too much, but it's going to stay really firm and upright like this. This dough does not rise like a bread loaf would. It's going to stay just like that. And then I put the other one on right next to it. And I do this on parchment paper so that it's easy to take up, but it's also not going to be cooking directly on aluminum. And then I throw it in the oven when it's ready to go. You will want these to bake at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 50 minutes. And I know they're done when they start to get a little golden on top, and they're not going to feel like real bread. They're kind of hard, and the outside's crunchy while the inside's soft and chewy. And I'm just going to show you what it looks like on the bottom when you peel it off of the parchment paper. These take a while to cool, and I'm testing them here and burning my finger a little bit. But once they are cooled off all the way, then you can slice them. I spent many, many years cutting these by hand, and I actually usually do 4 big logs at a time and freeze them. So that's a lot of hand slicing on something that's pretty hard and crunchy, especially on the outside. And you make do with what you have to make do with, but I saved up enough money and bought a meat slicer so that I wouldn't have to get hand cramps from using a bread knife to try and cut these. So then I just spend a few minutes slicing these up to the thickness that I want. You could do them thinner. You probably wouldn't want to do them thicker. But another thing you can do with this recipe, I can take these from this sliced form and put them in a food processor and grind them up. And then if you add some mayonnaise and whatever else you like in a chicken salad like mixture, if you like relish or whatever spices, then you just have this recipe, the gluten ground up with mayonnaise and spices, and then you have another sandwich topping or something you can eat with crackers. Once these are made and sliced up, I store them in an orderly fashion in a freezer bag in the freezer, and I pull out 10 to 12 slices at a time to thaw as we need them. And I wanted to share a parting thought in case there are still any meat eaters watching. There are no Christian vegetarians that I know that eat crickets or any other bugs and that want to force anyone else to eat crickets or any kind of other bugs. If you are a child of God, you know that He does not use force on anyone. And so if anyone's forcing you to change your diet against your will, no, it's not right. I don't agree with it. So consult with God or consult with yourself about what you want to eat and then do that. And don't waste a moment living in fear of what the media is trying to tell you is going to be put in your food. You control what you can control and you leave the rest to God. And you choose to live joyfully.